Starting things off in at number 10, we have prisoner 959. Let me set the scene for you guys. Okay, imagine a very dark, cold prison where all of the worst criminals are locked up behind bars. This prison barely has any rules, the guards are corrupted, and the prisoners would constantly start riots. The cells are even darker, and the feeling of the entire prison would make you think that this place was hell on earth. In the deepest part of the prison, there was one strange cell that nobody had been in except for a few high-ranked officials. One day a massive riot broke out, and a security guard tried to save his own life. He found the key to the airy cell and he opened it. As he was feeling around, he stumbled upon a large cylinder with a peephole. Once he looked inside, he saw a pair of eyes. One was a discolored white as if he were blind, and the other was blood red. The prison guard found a file in the cell that said prisoner 959. In that file, there were pictures of bodies that had been impaled through the mouth and out the coccyx. The bodies were full of blood and they didn't have any skin. The prison guards heard the inmates quickly approaching his cell, so he made a very tough call. He decided to free prisoner 959 in the hopes that he would kill anything and everything in his way so that he can escape. And sure enough, prisoner 959 brutally murdered almost everybody in cold blood, and once the riot was over, he was nowhere to be found. So he could be anywhere lurking in the dark, waiting for his next victim. Boulder City Prison rolls onto this list at number 9. So the sky was full of gloomy clouds and rain began to fall as Dixon Rhodes, the warden of Boulder City Penitentiary, drove towards his prison. As he approached the gates, he noticed that a new guard was stationed at the entrance, but he managed to open up the gate to the prison without any difficulties. The warden made it further into the prison and he noticed the blood splatter on the wall. He turned to another guard and asked him if there was a riot. The guard nodded his head and said yes, but everything is fine now. The guard opened the prison door with the keys and locked it behind the warden. As he made his way through, the room was dark, which was unacceptable, especially after a riot. A guard stepped beside the warden and began to escort him to the office, but suddenly they heard screams of pain and horror beside them. As the warden turned his head, he saw the guard who usually escorts him was locked behind a cell, and those new security guards were actually the prisoners seeking revenge on the warden. Number 8 brings us to the new fish. Technically this one is a Reddit no sleep story, but I had to include this in this video. You've all heard the term new fish, right? It's basically what inmates call the new set of prisoners that are coming straight into the penitentiary for the first time. But there was something off with this one new fish. As soon as he stepped into the prison property, the old convicts went wild because he was a good looking kid. The guards thought it would be best to put him in protective program because they knew that his life was in danger. But one of the high profile convicts had a lot of connections and called in for a favor. The next day the new fish was transferred into a cell, and that's when all hell broke loose. You could hear agonizing screams echoing in the whole prison, and some even say that they can hear the sound of flesh being torn and the sound of bones crushing. The next morning the guards inspected the cell and they were actually shocked to discover that the high profile con man was dead. His face was ripped off and all you can see is his organs everywhere and his bones and his skeleton. So somewhere within those prison walls there's a thing that has an insatiable hunger, and he definitely should never be messed with. Next up, number 7, we have prison numbers. A 27-year-old man was sentenced to spend 5 years behind bars at a new prison facility somewhere in the desert. This wasn't your typical prison. The place looked like it was brand new and barely lived in. The cells were massive, and some of them could even hold up to 10 or even 25 prisoners. Each prisoner was given a number and they were assigned to certain cell blocks. This one prisoner was given the number 5 from cell block D. Once he was locked up in his cell, he began to evaluate his other cellmates. Inmate 6 was friendly, but inmate 7 was the complete opposite. He was sketchy and he had some pretty strange habits, and inmate 9 was as normal as anyone could be. But one night, the sketchy inmate 7 followed number 9 into a dark, abandoned corridor, and this was during free time. Inmate 6 came running towards the man screaming, "He's crazy." Inmate 5 was a pretty curious man, so he decided to turn the corner to investigate. What he saw was mortifying. Inmate 9 was laying down, there was blood everywhere, and sketchy inmate 7 looked up and there was blood on everything. It was on his hands and his mouth. Then it hit him. He now understood why inmate 6 was afraid of 7. And that's because 7, 8, 9. I'm not sure whether this creepypasta was scary or just cringy, but you guys be the judge. I'm thinking it's cringy. I hate that joke. I've been getting letters from the St. Louis prison creepypasta, and this takes us into number 6. A very tall man with broad shoulders knocked on the door and passed the homeowner a letter that was stamped from the St. Louis Correctional Facility. The man thought to himself, I don't know anyone who is from that prison, but he went on to open the letter. On the envelope it said, please allow the courier to be present to witness the reading of this letter. As the man began to read it, he was thrown off by the horrific details. The person who wrote this said that they are serving a life sentence in prison for brutally murdering his family. He said his mind is being controlled by a demonic and sinister voice that has been telling him to murder them. And then he spit on the judge and tried to kill everyone in the courtroom. The letter talks about how he crushed his 2 young children's heads, and he did it with his bare hands, and how he strangled his wife to death. On the next day, the same courier came again with another letter. This time, it was a drawing of a woman who was being tortured. On the 3rd day, another letter came from the same courier, but this letter was different. The last lines read, the demon has grown bored with me being locked up like this. He told me how to end my curse. You make someone else pick up the demon's curse the same old way I did, by inviting him into your home 3 times. The man reading the letter just froze in shock, and he looked up at the courier. His eyes were endless black, and he had a cruel grin on his face. The Russian sleep experiment comes in at number 5. Alright guys, prepare yourselves, brace yourselves for this creepypasta slash urban legend, because it is pretty graphic and brutal. Let me take you guys back to the 1940s, where Russian researchers wanted to conduct an experiment to see what the effects were if you deprive yourself of sleep. Due to ethical reasons, they didn't want to pick any volunteers off the street, so they decided to force 5 prisoners to participate in this experiment. Yeah, like that's so ethical. The prisons were given an experimental gas that would prevent them from sleeping. Their conversations were recorded and monitored through video cameras and a 2-way mirror. For the first few days, everything was fine and the prisoners were behaving normally. But on the 5th day, that's when things got really bad. The prisoners became paranoid and started whispering about each other in the microphones. Eventually, the prisoners were running around screaming and almost breaking their own vocal cords. On the 15th day, the experimenters decided to put in fresh air instead of the harmful gas, but that actually just made things worse. One prisoner died and the others severely mutilated their bodies. They tore off their flesh, ripped out their abdomen and muscles. When the researchers came to remove them from the room, the prisoners, well, they actually refused, and they wanted to be locked up forever. Eventually, all of the prisoners were shot and killed because they wanted to cover up this highly unethical experiment. An empty prison is at number 4. At the Pembina prison, there were 5 floors and it had the capacity to hold 500 inmates. One inmate was sentenced to spend 365 days at this prison. Little did he know he may not make it out alive. The prisoners would talk to each other quietly between the cells and loudly between each floor. But during one night, the prisoners on the 1st floor were violently screaming in pain throughout the entire night. As the sun rose, all of the guards were gone and all of the prisoners were locked in their cells without getting any food, water, or exercise. So this lasted for several days, and as each day passed, another floor of prisoners would start screaming in pain and then stop. On day 364, the only floor that was left standing was the 5th floor. The prisoner had one hellish night left in the prison, but as it turns out, the thing or monster that was eating away at the prison was going to get him. Number 3, prison is hell. If you have any form of OCD, then this creepypasta will send chills down your spine. According to the story, a man with a mild form of OCD has been captured for brutally slaying 20 people. He chose to murder 20 people because it's a nice even number. After his 19th kill, he had an obsessive urge and desire to take someone's last breath. So when his 20th kill came around, he became sloppy. After he brutally attacked a woman on the side of the road with a lead pipe, the police managed to track him down and arrest him. He kept souvenirs from all of his murders so that the prosecutors were able to link him to all 20 murders. The judge wanted to give him the death penalty, but it was illegal in the state where he was. So the judge sentenced him to 1,001 life sentences because he he knew that giving him an odd number of years was equally as bad as a death penalty, if not worse, because it would linger with him for the rest of his life. Why I am no longer a prison guard comes into number 2. A newly graduated student picked up a random job as a corrections officer because the pay was good and they promised flexible hours and also benefits. Even though he had a degree in philosophy, he was desperate for a job. During his first week, he noticed that there was a strange looking inmate that would never socialize, and there was just something off about him. When he asked the other guards who the inmate was, they said, "Oh, that's just Dave, but stay away from him." But curiosity got the best of him. He went to the warden's office to ask about Dave, and the warden even said, "Do you like having a job? Do you like having a face? Then stop asking." Well, that would be enough for me to, leave Dave alone. I don't care who he is anymore. But this young and foolish CEO was desperate to find out some answers. So one day he went to Dave's cell. His cell was a little different from the rest. It had concrete walls and a door with a tiny window on it. The guard decided to go inside, and Dave stood there grinning and laughing like an evil maniac. Then all of a sudden the prison guard woke up attached to an IV with the dry blood all over his body. He actually had no idea what happened to him, but he still wakes up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. His heart is pounding and the feeling that someone is always watching him. So what went on in that cell? Nobody knows. And finally, number 1, why was I released from prison? Creepypasta. An inmate convicted of committing computer fraud was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security prison. But within just 3 months, his sentence was commuted and he didn't need to be placed on parole or probation. Why? Well, at the prison where he was serving his time, there was a legend about an old Nazi inmate named Old Jim who hung himself in his cell. He was notorious for haunting the prison, and anyone who looked inside of his dark, dead eyes, well, they would be mutilated and viciously murdered in their cell the next day. Of course, he thought these were only rumors until one night. The prisoners heard keys jangling up and down the corridor, but there wasn't a prison guard in sight. Suddenly, you can hear screams of extreme pain and footsteps slowly approaching his cell. The inmate closed his eyes and stayed in a paralyzed state until the morning, when the guards were dragging him to solitary confinement. The next day, he pulled into the warden's office and he said, "You survived something that has on more than one occasion killed every last inmate on that block. Someone or something decided that you should live. Who am I going to argue with a higher power?" So he has been released and sworn to keep that night a secret for as long as he is alive. But he can still hear keys rattling, and because of that night, he will never be the same.
It is a life of profound monotony.
Can't do nothing. Just sit there and look stupid. Same thing every day. Just lay down, read a book, and that's it.
So starting off this list, and at number 10, we have sitting at the wrong table. An inmate who was sentenced to 12 years in prison, he didn't know the proper etiquette when he started his sentence. He was a small 20-year-old man with no criminal history, so he had no idea on how the prison systems work. During lunch, he sat down at the wrong table because he got a lot of backlash. Racism still exists behind those concrete walls inside of prisons, and he learned the hard way. People from his race approached him and labeled him as a traitor because he didn't sit at their table. They told him that someone would come to his cell to slit his throat. Luckily for him, no one came, but he was constantly living in fear. I mean, why wouldn't he be? He was always looking over his shoulder, staying up at night, and sleeping with a shiv attached to his wrist just in case. Blood swabs comes onto this list at number 9. An inmate by the name of Louis Boy was sentenced to death for his involvement with the murder in New York City. However, his sentence was later waived by the governor and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But an opportunity came knocking on his door and he decided to take it. He was serving his time at Sing Sing prison, but he allowed himself to participate in one of the most insane experiments of all time. He agreed to be hooked up to a machine next to a girl who was suffering from cancer and her blood was filtered through his own body. This experiment didn't end up working, but Louis earned his freedom. I guess that goes to show you that a desperate man in prison with nothing to lose might be willing to do just about anything. Next up, number 8, we have a jigsaw trap. Okay, this doesn't sound good at all. This thing looks like it came straight out of the imagination of Jigsaw. Over in Iowa, a jail was opened in 1885 and it was known as the Squirrel Cage Jail. It had revolving pie-shaped cells that were inside of a cage. It had one opening which had to be turned into a specific way in order to let the inmate out.
Tiny pie-shaped cells rotating inside a fixed cage with only one opening. Until the two lined up, there was no way in and no way out.
This was definitely a faulty design because so many inmates would have had their limbs torn off or skulls crushed, and if the wheel broke, there'd be no way to get to the inmates. 4 inmates have died because of this, and so many others were injured. Thankfully, this prison closed in 1969, but it was believed that the ghost of the inmates still haunted this jail. Prison club fights punches onto this list in at number 7. Being an inmate definitely isn't ideal. You have to sleep with one eye open and you gotta constantly watch your back. But if the fear of being shanked wasn't enough, there are prison guards who have created their own visions of a fight club. Except participation isn't optional. This unorganized club is actually more common than you think. One of the worst cases comes from a prison in Pennsylvania where a lot of prison guards here have been caught severely beating and abusing the inmates. They have even forced them to participate in a last night fight club where dozens of inmates would get severely injured. They even used intimidation and threats in order to keep their club a secret. Moving along into number 6 is a prison riot. Let me take you over to the New Mexico State Penitentiary riot that happened on February 2nd to the 3rd, 1980. This was the most violent riot in American history because the prisoners managed to take complete control over the prison. 12 officers were taken hostage and several other inmates killed other prisoners. Some of them were tortured and mutilated because they were snitches or prison informants. Eventually, prison guards managed to get their control back after 36 hours. But by then, the damage was already done. 33 inmates had died, and more than 200 of them were being treated for injuries. Forced drug trials inject itself onto this list at number 5. The American government was forced feeding drugs to inmates to see how it would affect the body. So this is part of the MK Ultra controversial and secretive government program, which basically involved the government using tactics to control people's minds. They chose people who couldn't fight back, such as prisoners or mental patients, and they dosed them with a ton of LSD. In one example, a patient was given LSD for 174 straight days. 174 straight days. That is a whole lot of drugs. That would actually be the worst kind of torture. Where was their morals or ethics? I guess things haven't changed much since these trials because the government is still messing with people's lives. And now in number 4 is an unusual form of torture. Back in the day when British soldiers were stationed in Ireland, they needed a way to break their prisoners into telling them information. They quickly discovered that white noise and sleep deprivation were 2 things that seemed to work every time. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours with a hood over their head, they were subjected to constant white noise, and they were fed a diet of plain bread and water every single day. They were forced to stay awake and they were violently interrogated with severe beatings. The white noise and sleep deprivation don't sound as bad as being physically tortured, but in a way I actually think that it's worse. White noise and lack of sleep would definitely make you go insane. And for me, I would break if you just say, I'm only feeding you bread and water every day. I would tell you whatever you needed, because I need me some chicken. Prisoners being skinned takes us to number 3. It's not as bad as it sounds, but trust me, it is still pretty mortifying. In China, when a prisoner is executed, their bodies aren't laid to rest. Instead, they are skinned so that a beauty company can test products. If that isn't morbid, I don't know what is. A Chinese cosmetics company has admitted to using the harvest skin from the corpse in order to develop beauty products to sell in Europe. Note to self, never buy lip chap from Europe. Can you imagine if that was your family member and you wanted to give them a proper burial, but then you come to find out that they have been skinned? This is just way too intense for me. I feel pretty sick, so let's move on. Let's forget about that. And you know what? Forgotten about solitary confinement brings us to number 2. A man was arrested because police suspected him of drinking and driving, but he was then left in solitary confinement for nearly 2 days after prison guards They just forgot about him. Steven Slevin was never convicted of a crime, but he spent 22 months in a Mexico jail cell. His toenails grew so long that they began to curl under his feet, and he developed painful bed sores and fungus. He also became extremely delirious, and he even had to pull out his own tooth because he wasn't allowed to see a dentist. Both his mental and physical health suffered greatly, and even though no amount of money can ever give him back those 2 years, he was given a $15.5 million settlement to help him move on with his life. And now at number 1, we have police brutality. Police officers have an unspeakable bond. They will literally die for another and go any lengths to protect their own. And I'm only talking about a select few officers. This doesn't apply to everyone. Adolph Archie was convicted of murdering a police officer, and as we all know, cop killers don't do well in prison. He was shot in the arm by a prison guard, and instead of being transported to the nearest hospital, he was taken to the local police station where he was attacked by brutal police officers. Apparently there is a recording of the officers cursing and yelling at him, and you can hear them attacking his body. A few hours later he was taken to the hospital, and autopsy revealed that all of his teeth has been shattered. His skull was fractured in several places, and he had severe internal bleeding. The police said that he died from a fall, but clearly he died from a horrific beating.
Starting off this countdown, we have the Alice killings. I've talked about this creepypasta before, but basically it's a famous Japanese urban legend about a mysterious serial slayer. They would go around murdering random individuals. At the scene of their gruesome crime, they would leave a single playing card by the body with the name Alice written on it in the victim's blood. The killer ended up taking the lives of 5 individuals. Well, in 2003, there was a serial killer in Spain that would also leave playing cards by their victims, just like the Alice killer. He ended up slaying 6 individuals before the police caught him. Coming in at number 9, we have the Facebook messages. So the creepypasta I'm going to be talking about is the one titled "My Dead Girlfriend Keeps Messaging Me on Facebook," and it's pretty self-explanatory what happens. A guy's girlfriend passes away but keeps messaging him on Facebook saying random things, almost as if she's like toying with him from the dead. Well, in 2016, Kayla Brown and her boyfriend Charlie Carver were kidnapped by a serial killer. Charlie was killed, but Kayla was kept alive in a shipping container for 2 months. To avoid suspicion, the killer went on both of their Facebooks and sent messages and status updates to not worry friends and family. He said that they were fine and left on their own, but eventually he was caught and Kayla was rescued. Moving on to number 8, we have the Axeman of New Orleans. Legend goes that in the early 20th century, French photographer and inventor Edouard Martel was traveling the United States taking thousands of photos of the places he visited. He typically would hide his camera and set it to go off automatically. That way he could capture real life without people knowing. However, after reviewing his photos, he realized that he captured a brutal serial killer who police could never catch. He was named the Axeman of New Orleans, or New Orleans. You guys make fun of how I say that name. And now parts to this story are true. Parts are false. For starters, Edouard Alfred Martel is a real person, but he wasn't a photographer. Second, the Axeman of New Orleans was a real killer. During an 18-month spree from 1918 to 1919, he killed 6 individuals. So this creepypasta was based off of a real killer. In our 7th spot, we have the Green Man. Now, there are a bunch of different versions to the story, but they are all about a green man with no face that stalks the streets of Pennsylvania at night. Some say he was splashed with acid. Others say he was struck by lightning. Whatever happened to him, it turned his skin green and melted his face. They called him Charlie No Face, or the Green Man. As scary as it sounds, this story is completely true, but it's a really sad one. So Charlie No Face was indeed a real person. His name was Raymond Robinson. When he was a child, he was badly injured by an electrical accident that caused his face to appear disfigured. As a result, he was fearful of going out during the day, so at night, that's when he would go out and he would go for walks. He was completely harmless, but people who encountered him would be immediately frightened by his appearance. Making our way down the list at number 6, we have Capgras delusion. The creepypasta Capgras delusion is about a woman named Harriet Starling Malcolm. She ends up developing Capgras delusion as a result of a brain aneurysm and starts to believe her younger brother is an imposter. He's been replaced by someone that looks like him, but it isn't him. When Harriet passes away, way, her husband develops this disorder as well and ends up killing the brother. Capgras delusion is a real psychological condition. Those that suffer from it believe that people around them have been replaced by exact copies. Those with dementia or schizophrenia may also suffer from this delusion. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Barbie AVI. Barbie AVI is a pretty famous urban legend. It surrounds someone finding a mysterious video titled Barbie AVI. The video is very fuzzy and the sound is distorted, but it features a blonde woman getting interviewed. In the urban legend, the narrator recognizes where the video was filmed and ends up going to the place. They end up in an old abandoned building where they hear weird moans and whimpers coming from a room. They flee in a panic. Now, the backstory to this video is not real, but the creepy video itself certainly is. Over the years, a lot of people tried to figure out what the video was about. At one point in the video, the girl raises her arm and it's revealed that it's completely amputated. Some people think that the video was about BIID, body integrity identity disorder, and that the woman cut off her arm because she didn't find it to be beautiful. Eventually, it was revealed that her name is Tammy. When she was younger, she was washing clothes with an old school washing machine with no safety features. While the machine was operating, she stuck her arm in to push a sheet in more, and it ended up trapping her arm and twisting it until it ripped off. The video we see is when she's older and is trying to get a job at a modeling company, and it's her interview. In our 4th spot, we have the Russian sleep experiment, another very famous creepypasta, and boy is it creepy alright. The creepypasta is quite a lengthy read, but basically story goes that in the 1940s, Russian researchers were conducting unethical tests on enemy prisoners. They captured 5 enemies that they planned to keep awake for 30 days using a gas-based stimulant. They wanted to see the effects that sleep deprivation had on the brain. And in the end, everything goes wrong. They spiral into madness and then they all die in gruesome ways. Now, I hope this exact story isn't true, but it's quite possible that it was based on the number of real-world examples of governments experimenting on humans, like Project MKUltra, where CIA agents were injecting people with LSD, or Project Sleepless Soldiers, where Soviet soldiers were given a drug that let them fight for days without needing sleep. Moving on to number 3, we have Laughing Jack. Laughing Jack is a legend about a clown-type creature that likes to befriend children and then get them to commit dark deeds, or he even will harm them. He usually slices them open and replaces their organs with candy. Well, in 2015, a 12-year-old girl stabbed and killed her stepmom after Laughing Jack told her to do so. The girl claimed that she heard voices months before the stabbing occurred. She even begged her father for help, but Laughing Jack got to her. These creepypastas may not be real, but this just shows how real their influence is. Coming in at number 2, we have Slender Man. This dude went from being a Photoshop photo to a creepypasta and then a film star. His influence is huge, and I'm sure all of you know all about Mr. Slendy. Clearly, he's fake, but his influence is so real. In 2014, an Ohio woman was stabbed several times by her 13-year-old daughter, who claimed that Slender Man told her to do it. The woman claimed that she came home one night from work to her daughter standing in the kitchen wearing a white mask. She had her hood up and her hands were covered by her sleeves. She then was attacked by her own daughter. She had cuts on her neck and face and was stabbed in the back, all because of Slender Man. And in our number 1 spot, we have Walking Sam. Walking Sam is said to be a shadow demon that convinces people to commit suicide. It's said to live in the woods at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It appears as a thin, tall creature wearing a black top hat. It wears the souls of its victims dangling down from its arms. Here's the thing. In 2015, there was a huge amount of suicides in the area where Walking Sam is said to live. From 2014 to 2015, there was 103 suicides. Some say the number could be higher. One local said that there was more than 200 suicides in only 3 months. That's incredibly freaky. Maybe Walking Sam is real.